Before dawn behind the Vermilion walls. Settle a little more deeply into the place where you are resting. Let your shoulders grow heavy, and allow the room around you to become quiet. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing in this story will ask you to hurry. Tonight, we will pass slowly through the gates of the Forbidden City and spend an ordinary day among its red walls, glazed roofs, shaded corridors, paper windows, quiet offices, kitchens, studies, storerooms, and sleeping chambers. I'm the Yawning Historian, and our first walk begins before sunrise, when Beijing is still dark and the palace is only a collection of rooflines beneath the stars. The city within the city had stood at the heart of Beijing since the early 15th century. Completed in 1420 during the reign of the Yongle Emperor, it served the rulers of the Ming dynasty and then the Qing dynasty, along with their families and a very large community of officials, guards, eunuchs, palace women, cooks, clerks, artisans, porters, stable hands, and other workers. 24 emperors lived or ruled from this immense enclosure over nearly 5 centuries. Yet on an ordinary morning, before ceremonies filled its courtyards, the palace did not first appear as a symbol in a history book. It appeared as cold stone under a shoe, a wooden gate waiting to turn on its hinges, a lantern being trimmed, and the pale breath of a guard standing in the dark. Imagine that the season is early autumn during the long reign of the Qianlong Emperor in the 18th century. The exact routine changed from emperor to emperor, and it also changed with the season, the calendar, the demands of government, and the ruler's personal habits. We are not following a single surviving timetable minute by minute. Instead, we are gathering the ordinary rhythms recorded in palace regulations, meal archives, building histories, and objects that remain in the palace museum, and allowing them to settle into one representative day. Outside the southern walls, Beijing was still largely asleep. Small cooking fires had not yet brightened the alleys. The broad ceremonial road before the Meridian Gate lay empty beneath the last stars. To the north, beyond layer after layer of walls, the dark outline of Jingshan rose like a folded screen. Within the palace enclosure, the open courtyards held the chill of the night. Red pillars disappeared upward into shadow. Yellow roof tiles, invisible at midnight, had begun to catch a faint gray edge from the east. The great gates followed a strict daily rhythm. Palace museum accounts indicate that the gates usually opened between 4 and 5 in the morning and closed near 5 or 6 in the evening, though the precise time varied. An urgent traveler arriving at night could not simply knock and give a name. A divided permit, known as a matching tally, could be checked by fitting one carved half against the half held by the gatekeepers. In daylight, officials showed identity badges. Palace workers such as craftsmen, cooks, and cleaners carried wooden waist tags marked with identifying information and were checked against registers. Long before a modern office badge, a small object at the belt quietly decided which door a person might pass. At one of the outer gates, guards changed their weight from one foot to the other while waiting for the first signs of movement. Regulations placed more than a dozen guards at a gate in shifts during the day. Their swords and red staffs belonged to the formal language of authority, but the hour before dawn reduced authority to ordinary physical details. A sleeve needed straightening. A lantern wick needed lifting. A register needed to be opened on a desk. The desk was wooden, the ink was cold, and the first names of the day would soon be brushed into order. Officials approaching court had already left their homes in darkness. Near the palace, dismounting steels reminded civil officials to leave their sedan chairs and military officials to dismount from their horses. Only certain high-ranking or elderly men with special permission could ride farther, and even they eventually continued on foot. The distances inside the Forbidden City were greater than a painted map suggested. The official who passed one gate still had courtyards, bridges, side doors, and more guarded thresholds ahead. The sound of his steps crossed stone, faded beneath a gateway, and returned in another courtyard. The plan of the palace made movement meaningful. The southern part, often called the outer court, held the great ceremonial halls. The northern inner court contained the residences and many spaces of daily life. Along the central axis stood a sequence of halls with names that expressed harmony, purity, tranquility, and the proper ordering of heaven and earth. To either side, offices, workshops, storage rooms, gardens, shrines, guard posts, kitchens, schools, and residential compounds made the grand geometry livable. The Hall of Supreme Harmony was the most imposing of the ceremonial buildings, but it was not an ordinary throne room used for every hour of every day. It belonged especially to major occasions such as enthronements, imperial weddings, New Year ceremonies, and important audiences. Its high terrace and broad court expressed a scale larger than the individual body. On a quiet morning without a great ceremony, the hall could remain still while the government worked in less theatrical spaces. Empty grandeur was part of the palace too. By the Qing period, emperors often conducted much of their daily work in the Hall of Mental Cultivation, the Yangxindian, west of the inner court's central line. It was a more intimate complex than the great halls of the south. Here rooms for work stood near rooms for rest. A ruler might read memorials, meet trusted officials, write with a brush, study a painting, eat, and sleep within a comparatively compact group of chambers. Power did not always sit alone beneath the highest roof. It often bent over a low table, surrounded by paper. Before the emperor began his day, other people had already been working for hours. A servant checked a brazier and made certain no dangerous ember remained where it should not. Another arranged writing tools, brush, inkstone, water, paper, and perhaps a paperweight. A clerk prepared bundles of documents. A eunuch waited to carry a message. In a nearby service space, hot water was moved in covered vessels. The palace was waking from the edges inward. The emperor's sleeping arrangements were not always as simple as one magnificent bed in one fixed bedroom. Different rulers favored different chambers, and the Qing court's use of the Hall of Mental Cultivation changed over time. Rooms could be divided by screens, curtains, platforms, and alcoves. Heated brick channels beneath floors and beds carried warm air from fires tended outside, a palace version of northern China's fire-heated floors and Kong beds. In winter, the warmth arrived without an open flame in the sleeping room. It rose quietly through brick and tile. When the emperor woke, dressing was itself a sequence of decisions. Court robes, everyday robes, hats, belts, boots, beads, and accessories followed rules of rank, season, and occasion. A formal audience required one set of materials and symbols. Private study allowed another. The dragon robe familiar from museum displays was not a single uniform pulled on every morning regardless of purpose. Palace clothing was a language, and the day's duties determined which sentences would be spoken in silk. Attendants handled garments carefully. Fabric slid from a chest. A sleeve opened. A belt fitting was checked. A hat stood ready on a support that might itself be carved, lacquered, or fitted with a small clock. The Palace Museum preserves clocks made as hat stands, mirrors fitted with watches, and other objects in which timekeeping joined ordinary use. In the 18th century Qing court, mechanical clocks from Britain and continental Europe stood beside clocks made in Guangzhou, Suzhou, and Imperial workshops. Older methods of marking time, including sundials and water-based devices, had not vanished at once. The palace listened to more than one kind of time. The ruler's first work could begin very early. Qing emperors were expected, at least in principle, to embody diligence. Some rose well before dawn to read memorials or receive officials. The surviving record is uneven, and no two reigns should be folded into one perfect routine, but the image of papers waiting in lamplight is a sound one. The empire sent its concerns toward Beijing in written form. Harvests, river works, appointments, punishments, troop movements, taxes, weather, ceremonies, local disputes, and requests of every scale. A memorial was both information and object. It had traveled. Someone had selected paper, written characters, folded or enclosed the text, sealed it, registered it, guarded it, and carried it across roads. By the time it reached an imperial desk, many hands had already shaped its journey. The emperor might mark a response in vermilion ink. A short line written in the inner palace could then begin another long journey outward. The brush moved with a faint sound, softer than a turning page. Ink deepened where the tip paused. A servant standing at a respectful distance learned to hear without appearing to listen. The lamp flame made a small amber pool over the desk. Beyond the paper window, the courtyard remained blue with the last hour of night. The rules of access mattered because government depended on controlled nearness. Under the Qing, officials of various ranks could submit memorials and request an audience, correcting some of the delays that had troubled earlier systems. But this did not make the palace casually open. At each threshold, the right badge, gate, hour, and permission still mattered. A minister who entered the enclosure did not wander. His route had been decided before his first footstep. As dawn approached, the palace sounds accumulated very gradually. There was no single bell that transformed silence into bustle. A doorbar lifted. A broom whispered along stone. A covered box was set down. Boots passed at the far end of a corridor. A raven called from a roof ridge, where ceramic guardian figures stood in an orderly line above the eaves. Water in one of the great bronze or iron vats held the dim reflection of the sky. These vats were not flower pots. Hundreds were placed throughout the palace to store water for fighting fire. The largest wooden palace complex in the world always lived beside the risk of flame. Lanterns, kitchens, braziers, heated floors, incense, and lightning all existed among timber columns, painted beams, paper windows, curtains, and stored textiles. Fire prevention was not a dramatic thought reserved for disasters. It was a daily routine of checking water, tending heat, watching smoke, and obeying rules. In winter, the water vats themselves had to be kept from freezing. Small fires could be maintained beneath certain vats, making the prevention of fire depend, with quiet irony, upon carefully controlled fire. A worker passing in the darkness might pause to inspect the warmth beneath a vat. He did not need to think of the whole palace. His task was only to keep this water liquid through the coldest hour. The eastern sky lightened. Yellow tiles began to separate from the blue-gray roofs. The glazed surfaces had been chosen not simply for beauty, but as part of an architectural language. Imperial yellow dominated the major roofs. Red walls framed courtyards and directed movement. White marble terraces lifted the principal halls. The colors were brighter in daylight, yet before sunrise they rested close together, muted by the air. Morning court, when held, involved preparation far beyond the ruler's chamber. Officials arranged themselves by rank. Ceremonial specialists attended to placement and timing. Guards stood where the regulations required. Robes and court beads formed ordered rows. The great courtyards were designed to make hierarchy visible across space. Nearness to the central axis, the direction a person faced, and the gate through which he entered all carried meaning. For most days, however, Government included smaller audiences and long stretches of reading. The Qing state was not operated by pageantry alone. The emperor met grand counselors or other trusted officials, listened to reports, asked for clarification, and returned to documents. The men who waited to speak had rehearsed the facts they needed to present. A forgotten number or imprecise phrase could matter. Yet in our quiet telling, their voices remain low, absorbed by timber and plaster. Tea might arrive. The court maintained specialized arrangements for tea and meals, and water for imperial use could be brought from Yuchuan, the jade spring west of Beijing. The importance attached to water quality appears in palace dietary records and traditions, though exact practices changed over time. A lidded bowl protected warmth and aroma. Steam gathered briefly beneath the cover. The emperor lifted it, and the smell of leaves joined paper, ink, wax, silk, and old wood. At some point after 6 in the morning, sometimes later, the emperor's first formal meal would be served. Qing palace practice commonly arranged 2 main meals rather than the modern pattern of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The first could fall between 6 and 8, while the second often came around noon or early afternoon. Snacks, wine, tea, fruit, or other refreshments could be ordered at different hours. The exact moment of eating moved with the ruler's work. Before that meal arrives in our next story, we can remain for a while in the workroom. On the desk are papers from provinces that the emperor may never visit that year. On a side table is a small ancient bronze or a piece of jade, perhaps selected from the enormous imperial collections. A painting may be unrolled for examination. The Qianlong emperor in particular surrounded himself with art, books, seals, poems, inscriptions, and objects connected to earlier dynasties. He wrote or commissioned records of his engagement with them, leaving layer upon layer of imperial attention. This habit created work for scholars, catalogers, painters, mount makers, box makers, seal cutters, and conservators, though that modern word does not perfectly describe their roles. An old painting did not simply appear before the throne. It came from storage, was checked, carried, unwrapped, displayed, recorded, and returned. A small moment of appreciation in a quiet chamber depended on a chain of careful labor. The emperor's library world also included major repositories. The belvedere of literary profundity, when Yuan Go, was built during Qianlong's reign to house a copy of the complete library of the 4 treasuries. Its black glazed roof, edged with green, differed from the imperial yellow around it. Black was associated with water and therefore offered an auspicious protection against fire, especially appropriate for a building filled with books. Even the roof color expressed a hope that paper and flame would remain far apart. The emperor might compose poetry, practice calligraphy, study a text, or examine calculations. Kangxi had taken a notable interest in mathematics, astronomy, and knowledge introduced by Jesuit specialists. By Qianlong's time, European painters and craftsmen still worked in imperial service, while foreign clocks continued to enter the court through trade, tribute, and purchase. These objects did not make the palace European. They entered a Chinese and Manchu courtly system that selected, remade, displayed, and interpreted them on its own terms. A clock in the room might be useful, decorative, musical, and amusing at once. Gilded figures moved when the mechanism released. A bird turned. A small bell sounded. Some elaborate clocks were created in Britain. Others came from workshops in Guangzhou or Suzhou. Still others were made or repaired by craftsmen attached to the imperial workshops. Their mechanisms required winding, cleaning, adjustment, and patient hands. The clock's music ended. The last note disappeared into the wooden chamber, and work resumed. In another part of the inner court, The young princes had been awake for even longer. Their formal education could begin before dawn, a subject we will visit in a later chapter. In residential courtyards, palace women and attendants prepared for their own routines. In kitchens, fires were already active. At guarded gates, the flow of badges and waist tags continued. The palace did not wake around one person alone, even though its planning and regulations placed the emperor at the center. The ruler's day was also shaped by ritual obligations. On ordinary dates, these might be modest, while festivals, ancestral observances, seasonal rites, imperial birthdays, weddings, and New Year ceremonies transformed the schedule. At the beginning of the lunar year, for example, a Qing emperor could move through a demanding sequence of blessings, worship, greetings, banquets, and formal appearances from midnight onward. The ordinary working morning we are imagining was gentler than that ceremonial marathon. Still, ritual remained present in small gestures. The placement of a seat, the direction of a bow, the order of names in a document, and the form of a robe connected daily behavior to the wider structure of the dynasty. Repetition gave the court its continuity. People learned the correct way to hold, announce, carry, open, kneel, rise, wait, and withdraw. For the emperor, this order offered command but very little anonymity. Meals were recorded, movements were noticed, words were copied, clothes signaled intention, servants remained near, officials waited. The private chambers of the ruler were private only by palace standards. Even rest required attendance and procedures. The sun was now above the eastern roofs. The red of the walls had warmed. Courtyard shadows became sharp beneath the eaves, while the central paving stones brightened. On carved marble ramps, dragons moved through stone clouds without moving at all. Swallows crossed the open air and disappeared behind a roof. From the perspective of a visitor today, the Forbidden City often appears to be a sequence of magnificent empty spaces. In the 18th century, those spaces were full of controlled circulation. A great court might remain open in the center while people passed along its edges. Service routes allowed food, fuel, water, paper, laundry, furniture, and messages to reach the right compounds. The palace was ceremonial architecture, but it was also logistics performed every day. By the time the emperor paused over the last memorial of the morning session, dozens of small routines had already succeeded. The gates had opened. Registers had matched names to faces. Fires had been controlled. Water had been carried. Rooms had been warmed. Clothes had been laid out. Documents had arrived. Brushes had been washed. Tea had remained hot. None of these tasks would appear in a grand court painting. Yet without them the painted order could not exist. A quiet signal was given. The first meal would soon be presented. We will follow it in the next story, back through covered corridors toward the Imperial kitchens, where cooks, officials, box carriers, and attendants turned ingredients into a carefully documented meal. For now, allow the workroom to grow still. The emperor sets down his brush. A servant replaces the cover over the inkstone. Sunlight reaches the paper window one narrow panel at a time. Beyond the chamber, footsteps approach and then soften. A covered food box is carried with both hands. Steam waits beneath porcelain lids. The red walls hold the morning warmth. The roof tiles shine quietly above them. And the long day inside the Forbidden City has only just begun. the kitchens behind the red walls. There is no hurry at all as we leave the emperor's workroom and follow the covered food box backward through the palace. Its lacquered sides are warm. A folded cloth cushions the carrier's hands. The route is familiar, because meals in the Qing court moved through these passages every day, not as a single tray from one enormous kitchen, but as the finished work of a complicated household administration. The Forbidden City contains several kitchens serving different people and purposes. Palace Museum records describe an imperial kitchen responsible for the emperor, along with tea kitchens, kitchens for the Empress Dowager, Empress, princes, guards, and other parts of the court. Banquets required arrangements different from an ordinary meal. A bowl of noodles requested in a private room belonged to a different rhythm from hundreds of dishes prepared for a festival. The whole system was supervised through the Imperial Household Department and related offices. Titles, responsibilities, allowances, lists, seals, and records stood behind every steaming bowl. A palace meal began in paperwork long before it reached a stove. In our representative 18th century morning, the kitchens had awakened while the sky was still dark. Fires were kindled carefully in brick hearths. Water came to warmth in metal vessels. Knives met chopping boards with a steady, unhurried sound. A cook lifted the lid from a container of rice. Another checked poultry prepared by assistants. Vegetables waited in baskets, some fresh for the season, others dried, salted, or stored. The smell of grain, broth, smoke, ginger, scallion, and wormwood gathered beneath the rafters. The word imperial can make every meal seem impossibly extravagant. The court did maintain enormous formal allowances. Surviving Qing regulations list daily quantities of meat, poultry, milk, tea, vegetables, grain, condiments, and water assigned according to rank. The emperor's official allotment could include amounts far beyond what one person could eat. These figures represented the resources of a household and the obligations of a provisioning system, not necessarily the contents of one's stomach. Ingredients fed attendants, supported kitchens, entered gifts or offerings, and were managed within an establishment much larger than the ruler alone. Rank shaped food just as it shaped clothing and architecture. The emperor, empress dowager, empress, consorts, princes, princesses, and other members of the household received differing allocations. Their bowls and plates also differed in material, decoration, and number. A place setting was never simply a place setting. Porcelain announced position before the food was tasted. The emperor usually ate 2 principal meals in a day. The first was served after about 6 in the morning, sometimes closer to 8. The second came after noon, often around 2. Between them, snacks, tea, wine, fruit, or other dishes could be ordered. The labels translated as breakfast and dinner can feel odd to a modern listener, because the second formal meal arrived while the afternoon was still young. The palace day had begun long before sunrise, and its mealtimes followed that early rhythm. Meals were not necessarily taken in one dining hall. The emperor could order food where he was working, resting, or attending an activity. During Qianlong's reign, records place meals in parts of the hall of mental cultivation, the studio of cleansing fragrance, the palace of double glory, and other spaces. A room became a dining room when the appropriate tables, vessels, attendants, and dishes arrived. This mobility required practice. When the order to serve was given, attendants placed the tables. Other eunuchs collected the prepared dishes from the kitchens. Food traveled in covered boxes, carried with both hands. Only at the emperor's table were the vessels removed and arranged. The route had to be quick enough for warmth, but quiet enough for court. Before a dish was presented, it belonged to a record. Meal lists could identify what had been prepared and who was responsible. The records served administration and accountability. Palace tradition also required attendants near the emperor to taste small portions, a ritual linked to safety. The familiar image of a silver object magically detecting every poison is too simple. The more dependable protection was procedural. Controlled ingredients, known cooks, named dishes, guarded routes, responsible attendants, and visible service. Let us pause at a work table before the meal is carried away. A cook shapes small pieces of dough. Another stirs a broth whose surface moves only at the edges. Porcelain bowls wait in rows. Some are blue and white, some enameled, some marked for a particular rank or use. A cloth is folded over a lacquer tray. The kitchen is busy, but it is not chaotic. Everyone has learned the narrow space in which a body should stand. The Qing court inherited culinary traditions from many regions and communities. Its rulers were Manchu, governing an empire with a vast Chinese majority and many other peoples. Palace food could combine Manchu customs with northern Chinese staples, dishes from the south, Mongolian influences, Buddhist vegetarian preparations, and food sent as tribute or introduced through trade. The menu changed with season, festival, travel, health, availability, and personal preference. Milk products held a place in Manchu food traditions. Grain arrived in different varieties. Pork, mutton, poultry, fish, and game appeared in records. Vegetables followed the seasons and storage systems. Tea connected the palace to distant growing regions and tribute networks. The kitchen table therefore held a quiet map of the empire, though the people who raised, packed, transported, inspected, and carried those ingredients remained far from the emperor's chamber. Water mattered too. Palace records refer to water brought from Jade Spring west of Beijing for imperial use. Whether for tea, cooking, or drinking, water could be ranked by taste and reputation. It arrived in containers after its own journey through gates and registers. In a room filled with rare porcelain and costly food, clear water remained one of the most carefully regarded ingredients. The first main meal commonly included many dishes and small plates, along with staple foods and porridge or soup. An official description of ordinary Qing imperial dining notes more than 20 dishes, several staples, and 2 porridges or soups. This does not mean the emperor finished them all. Variety displayed abundance and allowed choice. Leftovers and uneaten portions moved according to household practices that could include distribution or reuse, though the details differed across reigns. The scale of service produced a peculiar kind of solitude. The emperor usually ate alone. The empress dowager, empress, and consorts ordinarily took meals in their own residences, supplied by their own kitchens or designated arrangements. Shared family banquets were special precisely because daily dining was separated by status and residence. The grandest table in the palace was often a table for one. Imagine the meal arriving in the east warmth chamber of the hall of mental cultivation. A low table is set. The food boxes are opened only at the final stage. Porcelain touches wood with a soft click. Lids lift, and steam releases the smell of rice, clear broth, roasted meat, pickled vegetables, and tea. The dishes form an orderly field of color around one place. An attendant announces each item in the proper manner. Another waits for a signal. The emperor eats a little from one bowl and then another. Work has not disappeared. A document may wait nearby. An official may be expected after the meal. The main dishes cool while the schedule continues. Court meal archives preserve details because eating was part of governance. They reveal where a ruler ate, what was served, which cooks were named, and how special occasions differed from ordinary ones. A menu can seem trivial beside wars, taxes, and diplomacy, yet it shows the state at the scale of appetite. It records supply, hierarchy, labor, season, fashion, health, and memory. Certain foods carried ceremonial meanings. During the new year, a Qing emperor might eat vegetarian dumplings in a private ritual connected to the turning of the year and remembrance of ancestors. Palace museum accounts describe Emperor Jiaqing eating such dumplings in the Hall of Manifesting Benevolence. A small serving could be placed in a bowl with auspicious decoration, accompanied by pickles, cold dishes, sauce, and vinegar. Coins associated with the Qianlong and Jiaqing reigns might form part of the ceremony. The dish was modest in size, but dense with symbolism. The timing of those New Year dumplings had to be exact. The emperor moved through a sequence of midnight writing, worship, greetings, and ceremonies. Kitchen workers needed to predict his arrival so that the dumplings were ready and hot. Somewhere out of sight, a pot simmered while attendants listened for news from the preceding hall. Festival banquets expanded the system dramatically. At a Qing New Year family gathering, the emperor and empress sat according to strict arrangements. Consorts were placed by rank, court music played, and performances could accompany the meal. Records cited by the Palace Museum describe over 100 dishes on the emperor's banquet table in one setting, with additional soups and wines. Such a table was not ordinary dinner. It was abundance made ceremonial. The dishes themselves were carried in waves. Tables, utensils, heating arrangements, musicians, performers, officials, and cleaning crews all had to appear in the proper sequence. After the last guest withdrew, the work did not end. Bowls returned for washing and counting. Cloths were gathered. Leftover fuel was made safe. Lists were checked. The banquet dissolved back into administration. For everyday life, the quieter tea service may tell us more. Tea leaves were measured. Water was heated to the preferred point. A bowl or pot was warmed. The liquid was poured and carried before its aroma faded. In the stillness of a study, a covered bowl kept out dust and held the heat. The emperor could use the lid to move floating leaves aside before sipping. Tea also belonged to scholarship, audience, hospitality, medicine, and ritual. Different teas entered the court from different regions. Some arrived as tribute. Some were stored for particular seasons. Tea vessels ranged from restrained ceramics to elaborate enamel and jade. Yet the simplest physical sequence remained recognizable. Dry leaf, hot water, rising steam, cooling cup. The kitchens had to manage cold as carefully as heat. Beijing winters could preserve food, but also freeze water and make transport difficult. Summers raised the opposite problem. The palace used ice stored from winter in ice houses, part of a broader northern Chinese practice of cutting, storing, and distributing ice. Ice could cool rooms, drinks, and food during hot months. A block lifted in winter darkness might not be used until the air shimmered many months later. Storage rooms held grain, dried goods, tea, seasonings, vessels, fuel, and textiles used in service. Containers needed labels. Quantities needed records. Pests and damp had to be watched. A damaged lid or cracked jar was a small problem only until it spoiled something reserved for a ceremony. Fuel arrived in equally organized ways. Firewood and coal supported kitchens and winter heating. The Qing court maintained a firewood depot responsible for storing and transporting such supplies. Good charcoal was valuable. In the warm rooms of the elite, it burned in braziers or heated channels beneath floors. In the kitchen, a cook judged fire by color, sound, and the feel of heat on a hand held near the stove. The palace did not grant equal warmth to everyone. High-ranking residents and important halls received the best heating arrangements, while workers in service rooms and guards at gates endured more of the Beijing cold. The same was true of food. Elaborate official allotments at the top rested upon more modest meals below. We can move from the Imperial kitchen to a smaller room where food for attendants is being prepared. Bowls are plainer. Portions are direct. Millet, vegetables, perhaps a little meat, and hot water restore warmth after hours of work. A carrier who has spent the morning moving lacquer boxes finally sits near a wall for a few minutes. He wraps both hands around a bowl before eating. The people who cooked for the emperor worked within a hierarchy of their own. Supervising officials stood above cooks, stove workers, assistants, carriers, cleaners, and suppliers. Skill mattered, but so did trust and appointment. A dish that pleased the ruler might be requested again. A mistake could enter the record. Most meals, however, ended without praise or punishment. Their success was invisibility. Medical ideas also shaped eating. Court physicians could recommend or discourage foods according to the season and the ruler's condition. Ingredients might be understood as warming, cooling, strengthening, drying, or moistening. Medicinal substances appeared in soups, teas, and preparations. The boundary between food and medicine was not always sharp. A palace pharmacy and collection of medical utensils formed another part of household life. The palace museum preserves medicine tools, containers, and materials among its collections of everyday objects. Illness in the imperial family summoned doctors, attendants, records, prescriptions, and anxious observation. But even healthy days carried small preventive habits in what was eaten or avoided. Food also moved outward as gifts. The emperor could bestow dishes, fruit, tea, or other provisions upon relatives and officials. A portion sent from the imperial table carried more than flavor. It expressed favor and connection. The recipient accepted not merely a meal but attention from the center. Local officials and regions sent delicacies inward as tribute. The journey could be difficult. Freshness, packaging, distance, weather, and cost all mattered. An exotic fruit admired briefly in Beijing might represent extensive labor along the route. The court's appetite reached into farms, rivers, forests, workshops, markets, and transport networks across the empire. Yet the emperor did not spend every day eating rare wonders. Palace meal records also contain recurring staples, familiar meats, porridges, pickles, noodles, dumplings, and seasonal vegetables. Repetition is one of the clearest signs of daily life. The ordinary dish returns after the festival dish has vanished. By early afternoon, the second principal meal was served. It might again appear where the emperor happened to be. In our imagined day, he has moved from government papers to a quieter chamber. Sun lies bright across the courtyard, but beneath the eaves the room remains cool. The table is set. A soup lid lifts. The emperor tastes, pauses, and looks toward a painting unrolled nearby. Outside the chamber, an attendant waits with a covered bowl that will not be needed. Another records the service. Farther back, kitchen workers begin the reverse movement. Boxes return. Empty vessels are counted. Surfaces are scrubbed. Ashes collected. Knives are cleaned and dried. Ingredients for snacks or evening requests remain ready. The palace's second meal did not mean the kitchens could sleep. Tea might be ordered. Fruit might be wanted during a performance. A late bowl of noodles could be requested. A religious observance could require an offering. A birthday, wedding, funeral, illness, journey, fast, or seasonal festival altered the usual plan. At dusk, the smell of cooking thinned. Fires were reduced, but never treated carelessly. Wooden palace buildings had suffered repeated disasters. A stove worker checked the hearth edges. Ash that looked dull could still hide heat. Charcoal was moved to a safe place. Water stood nearby. The last bowls were washed in fading light. Drops ran from porcelain and darkened the wood beneath a rack. A kitchen register received one more notation. The room that had been full of steam at dawn now held the quieter smells of soap, wet stone, stored grain, and cooled ash. The emperor had eaten, but the story of the meal belonged to hundreds of other motions. Grain measured, water carried, wood burned, vegetables washed, porcelain counted, records brushed, boxes lifted, gates crossed, dishes tasted, leftovers sorted, and embers made safe. We can leave the kitchens now and walk north through the inner court, where smaller courtyards held the private lives of the imperial family. The afternoon light is warm on the red walls. Behind a lattice window, silk is being folded. In another room, a woman reads while an attendant winds thread onto a spool. The kitchen door closes gently behind us. A final curl of steam disappears near the rafters, and the long red corridor ahead becomes quiet again. The quiet courtyards of the inner palace. The afternoon has softened as we enter the residential courtyards of the inner palace. The great ceremonial terraces are behind us. Here the spaces are smaller, the walls closer, and the sound of one courtyard does not easily pass into the next. A tree cast trembling leaves across a red wall. Silk shoes cross a threshold without scraping it. Somewhere beyond a carved screen, a shuttle passes through thread. Popular stories about the Forbidden City often fill these rooms with schemes, whispered rivalries, and sudden reversals. Court life did contain competition, loneliness, danger, and unequal power, and the records should not be made sweeter than they were. Yet drama was not the substance of every hour. Most hours were occupied by the same materials that fill any household: clothing, meals, lessons, greetings, health, work, worship, weather, sleep, and waiting. The inner court housed the emperor, the empress, imperial consorts, children, empress dowagers, attendants, palace women, and eunuchs in compounds ordered by rank and function. The central sequence included the palace of heavenly purity, the hall of union, and the palace of earthly tranquility. To the east and west stood groups of 6 palaces, along with many other residences, gardens, shrines, storerooms, and service rooms. The use of these buildings changed over centuries. A hall's formal name did not guarantee that every emperor or empress lived there in the same way. Rooms were reassigned, connected, repaired, partitioned, or favored by particular residents. To imagine daily life responsibly, we must allow the architecture to remain flexible within the boundaries of court regulation. An empress held the highest rank among the emperor's wives and consorts. Her position involved household authority, ritual responsibility, and symbolic partnership in certain state ceremonies. Below her, consorts occupied a graded hierarchy reflected in titles, residences, servants, clothing, food allowances, tableware, and forms of address. Rank decided much, but age, health, family connection, imperial favor, motherhood, and the presence of an empress dowager could complicate daily relations. In one eastern palace, an attendant opens shutters to admit the mild air. The room is furnished with a raised platform, a low table, stools, cabinets, screens, and hanging scrolls. A porcelain vase holds a few branches. Objects have been chosen not only for beauty, but for meaning. Bats suggest fortune because the words sound alike in Chinese. Peaches and cranes suggest longevity. Pomegranates with many seeds can express a wish for descendants. Rui-shaped clouds repeat the hope that affairs will unfold as wished. The Palace Museum holds thousands of Rui scepters made from jade, wood, metal, lacquer, porcelain, coral, and other materials. Long before becoming an elaborate court gift, the form was associated with a simple tool used to scratch an unreachable place. By the Qing period, Rui objects were presented for enthronements, weddings, birthdays, and New Year celebrations. In a residence, one might lie in a fitted box or stand among auspicious objects, carrying its quiet message without needing to be touched. The room's textiles changed with the season. Heavy curtains and padded coverings helped against winter cold. Fine gauze and bamboo screens made summer rooms lighter. Quilts, cushions, table covers, robes, shoe uppers, purses, handkerchiefs, and bed hangings required inspection, cleaning, repair, storage, and replacement. The abundance of imperial fabric created an abundance of fabric work. Some palace women were skilled in sewing and embroidery. Others served in domestic duties, personal attendance, cleaning, preparation of clothing, or specialized tasks within a residence. The details differed between Ming and Qing institutions, and surviving accounts often tell us more about regulations or unusual events than about ordinary individual feelings. We can still see the shape of the labor in the objects, a carefully bound edge, a nearly invisible repair, a button loop placed exactly where it should be. At a window, a young attendant sorts silk thread by color. Deep blue rests beside pale blue. Red moves through several shades before reaching pink. Gold-wrapped thread catches the light. She is not inventing a grand robe from imagination. She is completing a small floral section according to a pattern. The work rewards even breathing and steady hands. A higher-ranking woman in the room may spend part of the afternoon reading, practicing calligraphy, looking at paintings, playing a board game, listening to music, or speaking with relatives and attendants. Education varied widely. Some imperial women wrote poetry or painted. Some became knowledgeable patrons of religion and art. Others left little direct voice in the written record, even though inventories and household documents preserve traces of their material world. Manchu court customs existed beside Chinese literary traditions. Clothing, language, ritual, food, and family practice reflected the Qing dynasty's Manchu ruling house, while also drawing upon the longer institutions of the Chinese imperial court. Elite women might encounter Manchu and Chinese languages, different forms of dress, and varied ritual expectations. The palace was not culturally simple. Clothing made rank visible. Formal robes used regulated colors, motifs, accessories, and materials. Everyday dress allowed more variation, yet it remained shaped by status and fashion. A robe had to be selected for weather and occasion, brought from storage, aired, folded, and eventually repaired. Court portraits frieze magnificent clothing in perfect arrangement. Daily life included the moments before and after the portrait, when sleeves were adjusted and garments returned to chests. Hairdressing and personal preparation also required time and skilled assistance. Hairstyles changed across the Qing period. Pins, combs, flowers, jewels, and supports could form elaborate arrangements. The Palace Museum preserves mirrors, combs, cosmetic boxes, and small personal objects. A mirror might be fitted into a case with an imported mechanical watch. In the reflected room, global exchange became part of a morning routine. The private residences were still governed spaces. Servants came and went according to permission. Food was prepared through designated kitchens. Supplies were recorded. Visitors followed rules. A consort could not simply cross the palace whenever she wished. Courtyards gave privacy from public government, but they also marked boundaries. Meals commonly arrived at each residence rather than gathering the entire family at one table. The Empress, Empress Dowager, and consorts had their own provisions based on rank. Bowls, plates, and portions followed established standards. An attendant set the table, lifted covers, and waited. Conversation continued softly while dishes cooled. Tea filled many of the spaces between meals. A kettle was brought, leaves opened in hot water. A small sweet or piece of fruit might accompany the bowl. The woman nearest the window watched the courtyard tree move in the breeze. The scale of empire disappeared for a moment into the scale of a leaf against a wall. Women of the imperial household also participated in ritual. The empress's role could include ceremonies connected to ancestors, seasonal observances, sericulture, weddings, and the life cycle of the dynasty. In 1744, during Qianlong's reign, the Qing court established a ritual in which the empress worshipped the goddess of silkworms at an altar in the Western Garden and symbolically gathered mulberry leaves. Consorts and palace women took part, and selected cocoons were later presented within the imperial family. The ritual honored women's association with textile production and the broader agricultural order. Its golden tools and formal gestures were far removed from ordinary village sericulture. Yet they acknowledged that silk began with leaves, worms, cocoons, and patient labor. A robe crossing a palace threshold carried the work of many households far beyond the walls. Religious practice shaped the residences as well. The Qing palace contained spaces and objects connected to Tibetan Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Manchu shamanic rites, and other traditions. Residents burned incense, made offerings, recited texts, consulted calendars, and marked festival days. Personal devotion and state ritual sometimes shared the same building, and sometimes remained in small private shrines. Incense altered the air of a room. Smoke rose in a thin line before dispersing beneath the ceiling. An attendant trimmed a lamp. A fruit offering stood on a dish. Outside, someone swept fallen leaves from the paving stones. The sacred and the ordinary did not need separate hours. The Empress Dowager occupied a particularly important place in family and ritual life. As the emperor's mother or senior widow of the preceding generation, she could receive formal greetings and enjoy her own household, residence, entertainments, and influence. Respect toward parents was both personal and political. The emperor's public demonstrations of filial devotion affirmed a moral order larger than the family. Visits to an empress dowager involved proper clothing, announcements, processions, and greetings. On quiet days, the experience could also include conversation, tea, a meal, opera, or examination of gifts. The Palace of Compassion and Tranquility and later associated residential areas held parts of this senior female world. Their rooms were designed for comfort as well as ceremony. Opera was a favored court entertainment across many Qing reigns. Emperors and empress dowagers supported performances, and the Forbidden City contained stages of different sizes. The studio of cleansing fragrance was frequently used for family banquets and New Year celebrations. Larger festivals might bring drums, gongs, costumes, painted faces, scenery, and performances lasting many hours or even days. But performance could also be experienced at a smaller scale. Behind a screen, a few listeners followed a familiar scene. Tea cooled. An older woman knew the next line before it was sung. A child grew restless and was quietly settled by an attendant. The palace stage was magnificent, yet the human habits of an audience remained recognizable. Children brought different rhythms into the inner court. Imperial sons and daughters lived under carefully organized supervision. Nurses, attendants, tutors, and relatives shaped their days. Infant survival was uncertain even in the palace, and birth records sit beside records of mourning. A child's clothing might be covered with protective and auspicious symbols, each one expressing a hope that the wearer would remain healthy. Playthings entered the court from Chinese workshops and foreign trade. The Palace Museum describes increasing numbers of toys in the late Qing, when several emperors ascended as very young boys. Traditional dolls, miniature objects, puzzles, and mechanical novelties could share a room. A clockwork figure that delighted an adult collector could become even more fascinating to a child. Imperial daughters received education suited to rank and court expectations. Their lives were shaped by the possibility of marriage, often serving relationships within the Qing elite and the wider political world. Marriage could mean leaving the familiar courtyards. A wedding filled the palace with ritual objects and auspicious color, but beyond the ceremony stood a personal departure. For consorts, motherhood could alter status, duty, and daily attention. Children might be raised with extensive nursing and service arrangements rather than remaining constantly with their biological mothers. Court regulations separated affection into schedules and households. The record rarely preserves the small emotional negotiations this required, so a careful story should leave space around what cannot be known. The palace women who served these households lived under limits of their own. Some entered young. Their tasks were demanding, and their position exposed them to authority from above. Regulations could be strict. Historical studies of palace women also show that service might offer forms of training, responsibility, or limited social movement for some, though it should never be mistaken for freedom. Individual experiences varied more than a single label can hold. A maid responsible for clothing might know every missing stitch in a wardrobe. Another learned the correct way to prepare a room before a senior visitor arrived. One carried messages only within a particular compound. One maintained a shrine lamp. One attended at night and slept lightly in case she was called. The day contained long periods of waiting. Waiting is difficult to preserve in an archive because almost nothing happens, yet it may have filled more hours than ceremony. An attendant waited outside a curtain. A consort waited for news of a visit. A seamstress waited for better light. A child waited for a lesson to end. A messenger waited for permission to cross a gate. Gardens offered movement within the enclosure. The Imperial Garden north of the central inner court compressed rockeries, old trees, pavilions, incense burners, patterned paths, and seasonal plants into a relatively small space. Its ancient cypresses twisted upward between buildings. Decorative rocks suggested mountains. A few steps changed the view from a roof to a tree to an opening framed by stone. Members of the household could walk there under appropriate supervision. In spring, blossom appeared. Summer brought dense green and insects. Autumn sharpened the sky above yellow tiles. Winter reduced the garden to branch, rock, snow, and the dark green of evergreens. The same path offered 4 different worlds. Beyond the central garden, private garden spaces attached to particular residential areas allowed quieter enjoyment. Qianlong's retirement complex included an elaborate garden designed as a series of intimate scenes. Paintings, bamboo, rocks, pavilions, and interior decoration created places for looking, writing, conversation, and retreat. Even an emperor who planned to withdraw from rule carried the architecture of rule into retirement. As the afternoon cools in our eastern courtyard, servants prepare for evening. A heavier outer garment is brought. Lamps are checked, but not yet lit. The last sewing thread is tied and cut. A book closes. Tea leaves settle at the bottom of a bowl. The residence's heating needs depend on the season. In winter, brick channels beneath floors and bed platforms carried warm air from fires tended outside. Charcoal braziers and small hand or foot warmers added local heat for those entitled to them. Copper warmers could be decorated with enamel and pierced patterns, transforming a practical object into court art. Warmth remained unequal. The highest-ranking women in important halls received fuel, staff, and equipment on a scale unavailable to lower servants. A maid who placed a hand warmer beside her mistress might return to a much colder service room. Daily comfort showed hierarchy as clearly as formal dress. Fire made comfort possible and danger constant. Curtains, screens, lacquer, silk, and timber surrounded every ember. The person tending a brazier needed to know when charcoal was truly extinguished. A mistake made in a small room could travel across roofs and consume whole halls. For this reason, evening checks were part of care. Lamps begin to glow behind the lattice windows. The light is amber and contained, much dimmer than a modern room. Details beyond its circle soften. Embroidery colors lose their differences. A face at the far side of the chamber becomes an outline. An evening snack may arrive, though the two principal meals are finished. Perhaps there is warm milk tea, fruit, a small pastry, or a bowl requested for comfort. The vessel is placed, tasted, and removed through the same chain of service as the morning meal, only more quietly. Outside, the residential lane is nearly empty. A eunuch carries a message and disappears beneath a gate. A guard listens for the expected signals of closing. Roof shadows merge with the sky. Within one room, a woman writes a final line of poetry. Within another, an attendant folds a robe along practiced seams. Elsewhere, a child has already fallen asleep. These lives are close in distance and separated by walls, rank, and permission. No single story can recover the inner thoughts of all the women who lived here. Court archives were created mainly to govern, record, and preserve institutions, not to satisfy our wish for intimate diaries. Objects and rooms offer evidence, but they do not whisper every secret. The honest way to imagine is to remain near the materials we can see: worn thresholds, repaired textiles, meal lists, ritual vessels, portraits, poems, toys, mirrors, and the repeated architecture of private courtyards. Night settles above the 6 eastern and 6 western palaces. The last gold on the roof tiles fades. Behind red walls, dozens of separate households prepare to sleep. We will leave them without forcing their quiet into drama. A servant draws a curtain. A hand stove gives off its final warmth. Incense becomes a faint line in the dark. The courtyard tree stops moving as the evening wind falls. Ahead, however, one set of lamps will be lit again very early. Long before most of the palace wakes, young princes will make their way toward lessons near the gate of heavenly purity. Their books are waiting, their teachers are preparing, and the first characters of the morning will be read before sunrise. Lessons before sunrise. The palace is dark again, not because the day has ended in our journey, but because we have turned the clock back to the hour when the Imperial children began their lessons. In the Qing court, a prince's education was famous for starting early and lasting long. The exact schedule varied, and accounts sometimes preserve ideal regulations more clearly than every ordinary exception. But the rhythm was unmistakable: study before dawn, study through the morning, and very little of what a modern child would call a holiday. Near the gate of heavenly purity stood the upper study, the Shangshu Fong, established under the Kangxi Emperor as a formal school for imperial sons. Its location close to the emperor's working world carried a simple message. Learning was not decoration. It prepared a prince for service, discipline, and for one uncertain child among them, perhaps the throne. A prince might begin formal study around the age of 6. Palace Museum educational material describes the Qing routine with the phrase, "enter at Mao and leave at Shun," meaning that pupils came in the early morning and remained until the later afternoon. Some accounts place the earliest reading at 3 in the morning, while descriptions of the regular school day often have princes waiting for teachers by about 5. We need not force every rein into 1 minute. It is enough to enter a cold study while the lamps are still necessary. The boy is awake before he wishes to be. An attendant folds back the bedding. Warmth from the heated bed platform makes the surrounding air feel colder. Water is brought for washing. Clothing is layered in a practiced order. His hat is checked. A small meal or warm drink may be prepared, depending on schedule and household practice. Outside, a lantern waits. The path to the study crosses a courtyard where frost has silvered the edges of the stones. The prince is not alone. Attendants carry books, writing tools, extra clothing, and whatever the day requires. Guards know the group and admit it through the proper route. Within the schoolroom, desks stand in order. Paper, brushes, inkstones, and texts have been arranged. The light falls warmly on the nearest pages and leaves the upper beams in shadow. A teacher removes his outer gloves, if he has worn them, and warms his fingers before opening the lesson. Qing princes studied Chinese classical texts, history, poetry, calligraphy, and statecraft. They also learned Manchu language and the traditions the dynasty associated with its Manchu identity. Mongolian could be part of elite education as well. Riding and archery remained important, because Qing rulers repeatedly insisted that descendants of a conquering house should not forget martial skill. The curriculum joined library and training ground. A prince needed to recite, interpret, write, calculate, ride, draw a bow, understand ritual, and behave under observation. Success in one area did not cancel failure in another. The ideal imperial son was scholarly without becoming soft, martial without becoming disorderly, obedient without becoming dull, and capable without appearing dangerously ambitious. The last expectation could be especially complicated. A prince studied to become worthy, yet the politics of succession made visible ambition risky. Under several Qing emperors, the identity of the chosen heir was concealed. A sealed designation could be placed behind the plaque reading, "Let the righteous shine," in the Palace of Heavenly Purity, with another copy kept by the emperor. This system was intended to reduce open rivalry and avoid some of the difficulties of naming an heir too early. For a boy at his desk, however, succession was not the subject of every brushstroke. Most of the morning was more ordinary. The teacher read a line. The pupil repeated it. A phrase was explained. A historical example was offered. The boy copied characters until the structure of each one settled into his hand. Classical education relied heavily on memorization, but not on memorization alone. A teacher asked for meaning, moral interpretation, and application to government. Ming instructions for princely lectures had required tutors to connect texts to political conduct. Qing education further systematized the long school day. A passage about a ruler in antiquity could become a lesson in listening to ministers, controlling desire, respecting agriculture, or maintaining ritual. The teacher's own position required caution. He had been selected for scholarship and character. He needed to correct a prince who stood far above him by birth without either flattering or humiliating the child. Too much softness failed the educational purpose. Too much severity risked complaint. The most effective instruction was steady, predictable, and difficult to evade. Brushwork offered a quieter kind of discipline. Ink was ground with water in a circular motion. The smell was mineral and faint. A fine point gathered between the fingers. The prince copied a model, keeping the first stroke controlled and the last neither hurried nor weak. A blot revealed impatience immediately. Calligraphy was practical, artistic, and moral in elite culture. The written hand could be read as evidence of cultivation. An emperor annotated memorials, wrote poems, copied auspicious phrases, and produced calligraphy for plaques or gifts. The child's repeated characters therefore belonged to future government as much as to school. History lessons turned earlier dynasties into a storehouse of examples. Tutors used chronicles to show wise decisions, foolish excess, loyal advice, failed planning, and the slow consequences of policy. The child heard about emperors who listened and emperors who did not. Each story carried a judgment, even when the teacher spoke gently. Language lessons required the mouth and ear to work differently. Manchu script ran vertically and represented a language distinct from Chinese. The Qing court used Manchu in important government and identity practices, though its everyday strength changed over time. A prince was expected to maintain access to this dynastic inheritance. Copying vocabulary and reading aloud tied him to ancestors who had entered Beijing from beyond the Great Wall. The room grew lighter. Lamps were extinguished one by one. Paper windows changed from gray to cream. In the courtyard, the frost began to melt where sunlight reached it. Breakfast did not necessarily interrupt the lesson at the moment the prince wanted it. Palace Museum accounts note that if work was unfinished or a pupil was being disciplined through additional recitation or writing, he needed the teacher's permission to eat. Even then, the break was brief. Food arrived, was taken, and study resumed. Imagine a covered bowl of hot porridge, a little pickle, bread, or a filled pastry, and tea. The prince warms his hands on the bowl. An attendant waits behind him. The teacher uses the pause to review the next text. No school bell releases the room. The formal calendar offered few holidays. Palace Museum educational summaries name New Year, the Dragon Boat Festival, Mid-Autumn Festival, and the Emperor's birthday among the rare days away from the usual schedule. There was no weekly weekend and no long summer break. Even New Year's Eve could include lessons, though the day might end earlier. Weather could alter older Ming lecture schedules, with interruptions for severe winter, storms, or calendrical observances, but the Qing ideal remained famously demanding. The prince's status brought the best teachers and abundant materials. It did not bring an easy morning. After classical texts came composition or discussion. The teacher gave a theme. The pupil organized a response in the accepted form. A younger boy struggled to remember an allusion. An older brother completed his lines quickly and then had to sit without showing pride. The princes did not all learn at the same speed or share the same temperament. Some loved books. Some preferred horses. Some endured the curriculum because resistance only lengthened it. Historical records preserve especially accomplished imperial students, but an ordinary schoolroom must also have known yawns, wandering attention, ink-stained fingers, and the private counting of minutes. Attendants managed these human imperfections discreetly. A fresh brush appeared when one split. A sleeve was kept from dragging through wet ink. More warm water arrived. A cushion was adjusted. The servant could not learn the lesson for the prince, but he could remove every practical excuse. By late morning, the school day might turn toward physical training. Riding and archery expressed both skill and dynastic memory. The Qing had established power through military organization and horsemanship. Emperors warned descendants not to lose the older Manchu disciplines amid the comfort of palace life. The Imperial Muse and institutions responsible for horses formed part of the court's practical world. Animals needed feed, grooming, shoes, tack, exercise, veterinary care, and clean stalls. A prince's hour of riding depended on stable workers who began before him and ended after he left. At a practice ground, the boy exchanges the stillness of the desk for the controlled movement of a horse. An instructor called an anda teaches riding or archery. Winter breath rises from the animal's nostrils. Leather creaks. The prince learns to sit without fighting the motion beneath him. Archery begins with stance. Feet find their position. Shoulders lower. Fingers place the string. The bow is not pulled by excitement, but by repeatable technique. The instructor corrects an elbow. An arrow travels toward the target with a sound that seems louder after the quiet classroom. Skill at riding and archery could be displayed in courtly events and military examinations, but practice was built from unremarkable repetitions. Mount, dismount, set the feet, draw, release, retrieve, begin again. Physical training also included attention to seasonal conditions. Winter in Beijing was dry and cold. Summer was hot and dusty. Clothing, exercise time, and location adjusted. A prince who would one day join imperial hunts or journeys needed to endure more than a sheltered courtyard. The Qing court valued hunting, especially at places such as Mulan, as a means of training, ceremony, alliance, and identity. Palace lessons prepared the child for a wider landscape he might later cross with banners, guards, officials, tents, horses, and elaborate logistics. In the practice yard, that future was reduced to one calm animal and one patient instructor. After exercise, the prince returned to books. The transition was not always welcome. Sweat cooled beneath fresh clothing. The body wanted rest, but the desk still held unfinished pages. Mathematics, geography, astronomy, and practical knowledge could enter imperial education, especially under rulers such as Kangxi. Jesuit specialists served at the Qing court as astronomers, mathematicians, mapmakers, painters, and craftsmen. Ferdinand Verbius taught Kangxi mathematics and astronomy, and the emperor applied calculations to observations and instruments. Such interests varied by ruler, yet they made the palace study larger than the classical curriculum alone. A globe or astronomical instrument changed the scale of a lesson. The prince who had spent the morning inside layered walls now considered coastlines, latitudes, stars, and shadows. A teacher explained how a sundial marked the sun's movement. An imported clock divided hours with gears. Chinese astronomical traditions, Islamic knowledge used in earlier institutions, and European methods met in the work of the imperial court. Maps were political as well as educational. They represented routes, rivers, borders, administrative regions, and places from which tribute or reports traveled. A child traced a line far beyond Beijing. The brush tip crossed mountains he had never seen. The library itself taught habits that no formal lecture could replace. Books were not scattered loosely around the room. They were wrapped, boxed, labeled, shelved, borrowed under supervision, and returned. A pupil learned that knowledge had a physical life. Paper disliked damp. Ink faded in hard sunlight. Thread bindings loosened when handled carelessly. A missing volume was an administrative problem as well as an intellectual loss. A tutor selected a historical work and placed it on the desk. Before opening to the assigned passage, the prince read the title slip and examined the order of the volumes. The text belonged to a series larger than the page before him. Commentaries stood beside older words, adding generations of interpretation. To study a classic was to enter a conversation already many centuries long. Printing had made texts available in numbers manuscript culture could not easily match. Yet important palace books still involved careful correction, fine paper, clear carving, and controlled editions. Imperial publishing projects announced authority through scholarship. A prince turning one page encountered the work of authors, commentators, editors, calligraphers, block cutters, printers, binders, and librarians, though their names did not all appear before him. Sometimes the lesson moved from reading to comparison. Two accounts described the same reign differently. The teacher asked which detail could be trusted and why a later writer might judge an earlier ruler harshly. The exercise remained framed by accepted court values, but it introduced a useful discomfort. Written history was not a single transparent window. Painting could be another area of study or appreciation. The Qing court employed Chinese painters and European artists such as Giuseppe Castiglione, known in China as Lang Shining. His work combined techniques in ways suited to court patronage. A prince looking at such a painting learned not only to admire likeness, but to recognize the emperor's authority over representation. Music, ritual movement, and etiquette completed other parts of elite training. A prince needed to know how to stand at ceremonies, how to bow, how to approach a senior relative, and how to wear formal clothing without appearing uncomfortable. The body became a text memorized through repetition. In the afternoon, teachers might report progress. The emperor could summon tutors, ask about lessons, or command a son to recite, compose, or answer questions in person. The possibility of sudden inspection kept the schoolroom alert even when the emperor was elsewhere. Imagine being called from the upper study into a nearby hall. The prince walks behind an attendant, repeating the required passage silently. His father waits with documents at one side. The boy bows. A question is asked. For a moment, years of hierarchy narrow into one line of poetry. The answer comes correctly. The emperor gives no extravagant praise, only another question and a small nod. The prince withdraws. Outside the chamber, his breath finally leaves him. Not every inspection ended so comfortably. A poor answer could bring more study. Court discipline might be applied through tutors or attendants rather than in a way that openly compromised imperial dignity. The child learned that rank did not protect him from expectation. It multiplied expectation. The school day continued into the afternoon, sometimes for more than 10 hours from the first arrival. There might be only one or two short pauses. The shadows moved across the courtyard. Ink dried on page after page. Imperial daughters, too, received forms of education, though the institutional record and curriculum are less often described in the same detail as the prince's upper study. Literacy, household culture, ritual knowledge, needlework, art, and courtly conduct could shape their preparation. As with the boys, individual interest and opportunity varied. For all imperial children, learning occurred beyond formal lessons. They observed how adults addressed one another, how rank directed seating, how servants entered, how festivals unfolded, and how the emperor's mood changed a room. The palace itself was an unending teacher. At last, the formal school day ended. Books were closed and stacked. Brushes were washed. Inkstones were covered. The teacher's shoulders relaxed only after the pupils had left. The prince walked back through gates that had looked black before dawn and now glowed red in the late sun. His attendants carried the day's writing. A stable worker cooled the horse used hours earlier. A clerk recorded some detail of the lesson. The machinery of education settled toward evening. There was still homework, family duty, or preparation for tomorrow, but there might also be a short period of play. A carved puzzle, miniature object, kite, ball, board game, or mechanical toy could occupy the remaining light. In the late Qing, young emperors and princes encountered growing numbers of imported novelties alongside Chinese toys. A tiny mechanism crossed the room under its own power, and for a few moments the solemn future ruler became simply a child watching it move. Dinner, in the palace sense of the second principal meal, had already come earlier in the day, but an evening snack might be offered. A nurse or attendant checked the boy's health. Clothing was changed. The cold deepened outside. The prince returned to a warm chamber. Fire channels beneath the floor carried heat from an exterior stove. A hand warmer rested near the bed. The page he had copied in darkness that morning had been corrected in red. He reads the correction once more. Then the book is closed. Tomorrow, the routine will begin again before sunrise. The teacher will return. The same gate will open. A fresh sheet of paper will wait beneath the lamplight. For now, the child settles beneath embroidered covers while the palace around him grows still. Beyond his room, other people remain awake. Someone repairs the binding of a school text. Someone feeds the horse. Someone cleans the practice ground. Someone checks the charcoal heating the floor. The prince's education, like the emperor's meal, depends upon a community of labor. We will follow those workers next. Eunuchs carrying instructions, artisans shaping objects, guards checking gates, cleaners sweeping courtyards, and clerks making the thousands of small records that kept the palace from becoming only a beautiful shell. The school lamp is extinguished. On the desk, the last copied character dries slowly in the dark. The thousand hands of the imperial household. The prince's lamp has gone dark, but the people who maintained his school, his residence, and the palace around them have not all finished. We now turn away from the rooms named in guidebooks and enter the quieter geography of service. Workshops, guard rooms, kitchens, storerooms, offices, stables, corridors, gatehouses, fuel depots, laundries, and small courtyards where the Forbidden City was kept in working order. At its most visible, the palace was a monument to one ruler. At its most practical, it was a settlement sustained by thousands of people. Their exact numbers changed across reigns and between the Ming and Qing periods. Regulations, reforms, population shifts, financial pressures, and the personal size of each imperial household all mattered. It is safer to picture a large and changing community than to trust one dramatic number for every century. The Qing Imperial Household Department supervised much of the emperor's private estate and palace life. Its responsibilities reached into finance, food, clothing, workshops, estates, transport, ceremonies, servants, and supplies. Government offices outside the household administered the empire, while this inner bureaucracy made imperial daily life possible. The boundary between private household and state power was never entirely simple, because the emperor stood at the center of both. Eunuchs formed one of the best-known groups within palace service. Their history is often reduced either to secret power or to comic background figures. In reality, their work ranged across personal attendance, message carrying, doors, food service, cleaning, heating, lamps, storage, ritual assistance, gardens, theater, and many other tasks. A few individuals gained exceptional influence. Far more spent their lives performing repetitive duties inside strict hierarchies. The Qing rulers, mindful of earlier Ming experiences in which some eunuchs accumulated great political power, formally limited their ranks and roles. Regulations did not eliminate influence, favoritism, abuse, or informal networks, but they shaped the institution. A eunuch's actual life depended greatly on assignment. Service close to the emperor could bring opportunity and danger. Work in a remote storeroom could be obscure, cold, and physically tiring. Before dawn, a eunuch assigned to lamps moved through a corridor with trimming tools and fresh oil. He knew which rooms required light first. He lifted a glass or paper cover, removed a burnt piece of wick, cleaned soot, and checked for spills. The lamp had to burn steadily without smoking. In a timber palace, neatness around flame was a safety practice. Another worker attended the heating system. The fire floors of the Forbidden City used brick channels beneath rooms and bed platforms to carry hot air from stoves fed outside. Palace museum explanations describe eunuchs tending fires through exterior openings so warmth could pass beneath the floor. The room above received heat without smoke or open flame, provided that the channels drew properly and the fuel was managed with care. In severe winter, the worker knelt near the stove mouth and placed charcoal or fuel where the draft could take it. He watched the color of the embers. Too little fire left the resident cold. Too much, poorly managed, increased danger. His success was measured by an invisible result: a warm floor in another room. Elsewhere, cleaners began with brooms. Courtyards collected dust, leaves, snow, fallen blossoms, scraps of paper, and the marks of constant passage. A broad paved court required patient repeated strokes. Dust was moved without sending it into open chambers. Snow was cleared from routes before officials crossed them. The cleaner learned the dips where water gathered and the stones that became slippery first. The roofs demanded specialized attention. Glazed tiles cracked under weather. Mortar loosened. Plants could root in neglected joints. Decorative ridge figures were beautiful but exposed. Carpenters, masons, tile makers, painters, scaffold builders, and inspectors maintained the immense wooden complex through cycles of repair. Imperial architecture was never completed once and left untouched. Fire, rain, wind, insects, age, ceremonial fashion, and changing hues required rebuilding. Many halls seen today contain fabric from different periods because repair was continuous. A Ming foundation might support Qing reconstruction. A room could preserve an old name while its interior was transformed. The carpenter entered with tools wrapped for transport. He examined a door that no longer closed smoothly. Wood responds to moisture and season. The problem might be a hinge, a warped panel, a settling frame, or wear at the threshold. The repair needed to function without disturbing painted decoration more than necessary. Painters maintained the brilliant surfaces of palace architecture. Complex bracket sets beneath the eaves carried patterns and color. Red columns and doors needed renewal. Mineral pigments, binders, brushes, scaffolds, and skilled teams converted weathered timber back into imperial appearance. Yet fresh paint had to dry, and a newly restored gate probably smelled more like oil and work than timeless grandeur. The imperial workshops produced and repaired objects for the court. Craftsmen worked in jade, metal, enamel, glass, lacquer, wood, clock mechanisms, painting, textile mounting, carving, and many other materials. Some were permanent or long-serving specialists attached to the household. Others were recruited for particular expertise. Studies of Qing workshop records show that artisans' pay and conditions varied according to status, skill, assignment, and period. An order could begin with an imperial instruction. A design was sketched or described. Materials were selected. Supervisors reviewed progress. The object might be shown for approval and returned for alteration. The process could be efficient or frustrating, but it left detailed administrative traces because precious materials and labor needed accounting. In a small workshop, A jade worker studies a pale stone before cutting it. Jade is hard, and material once removed cannot be returned. Abrasive, water, drills, saws, and long patience shape the surface. The craftsman follows color and flaws hidden in the stone. An imperial request for a seemingly simple brush washer may occupy weeks or months of careful labor. Nearby, enamel workers build color through repeated firings. Metal forms must be prepared. Glassy mixtures are placed in small areas. Heat can reveal a successful surface or ruin it. The finished object may later stand in a quiet room holding flowers, while no visitor sees the anxious moment when it emerged from the kiln. Clockmakers faced a different problem. By the 18th century, the Qing court collected many mechanical clocks from Britain, France, Switzerland, Guangzhou, Suzhou, and imperial production. Palace workshops made and repaired mechanisms. Gears wore. Oils thickened. Leather or metal drive elements failed. Imported designs needed craftsmen who could learn by examination as well as instruction. A clock arrived because its music had stopped. The outer case glittered with gilding and enamel, but the worker's attention went to the movement. He removed a panel, noted the arrangement, and listened. A gear tooth caught. A spring released unevenly. Tiny tools lay on cloth, so no part rolled away. The Palace Museum's clock collection includes pieces that told time, played music, moved figures, imitated birds, supported hats, framed mirrors, or formed decorative landscapes. Such objects were entertainment and technology, but also ongoing maintenance obligations. Every marvelous moving bird eventually needed someone to open the cage and repair its gears. Painters in court workshops created portraits, records of ceremonies, designs for decorative arts, and images for imperial appreciation. Chinese artists worked beside Jesuit painters such as Giuseppe Castiglione, whose court career extended through several Qing reigns. Different visual traditions met under imperial direction. The result was not simply Western art imported into the palace or Chinese art left unchanged, but negotiated work shaped by patron, purpose, and workshop. Mounting a painting required its own specialists. Paper and silk were backed, joined, bordered, dried, polished, and attached to rollers. A fragile old work needed treatment gentle enough to preserve the image and strong enough to make handling possible. Storage boxes and wrappers protected it when the viewing ended. Book production employed copyists, editors, printers, binders, and box makers. Qianlong's enormous complete library of the four treasuries demanded scholarly selection and physical manufacture on a remarkable scale. Even a single volume required paper, ink, ruled lines, copied or printed text, correction, binding, labels, and storage. Multiply that sequence across thousands of works, and a library becomes a landscape of labor. Clerks served every department. They copied orders, maintained inventories, registered arrivals, noted expenses, and prepared reports. Their handwriting may be the clearest surviving trace of work that was otherwise invisible. A line in an account book could record charcoal delivered, silk issued, a broken bowl replaced, a craftsman paid, or a gate repaired. The clerk's day was physically repetitive. He sat at a table in changing light, held his brush upright, dried pages, checked numerals, tied bundles, and protected documents from damp. An error in quantity could follow supplies through several offices. Accuracy was a form of quiet power. Porters carried what the list described: grain, water, wood, coal, ice, furniture, boxes, theatrical scenery, ceremonial equipment, and gifts all moved through the palace. The central ceremonial spaces could not become cluttered with casual deliveries, so routes and timing mattered. A heavy object might require a team, padded poles, and someone walking ahead to clear thresholds. Doors were among the most frequent obstacles. Chinese palace architecture joined rooms and courtyards through raised thresholds intended in part to define and protect spaces. A carrier learned to lift at exactly the right moment. The person walking backward could not see the step, so the whole team moved by short-spoken signals. Gatekeepers controlled the circulation. Officials presented badges. Palace workers carried wooden waist tags marked with names and identifying information. Registers were checked. Different classes of entrant used designated gates. A cook arriving with a delivery did not follow the same route as a grand counselor approaching an audience. During daylight, more than a dozen guards could staff each major gate in shifts, according to Palace Museum accounts. They carried swords or red staffs and had authority to stop unauthorized approach. Their formal appearance communicated imperial control, but a long guard shift also involved cold feet, summer heat, dust, boredom, alertness, and careful recognition of routine faces. At night, the matching tally allowed emergency passage. One half remained with gatekeepers, and the other came from within. Only when the carved halves matched could the sealed boundary open. The procedure transformed a piece of wood into permission. Guards also watched walls, stores, and sensitive buildings. The palace's enclosure had layers: the forbidden city proper, the surrounding imperial city, and the larger city walls beyond. Security depended on controlled gates, patrols, watches, and the wider stability of the capital. Historical breaches showed that rules alone could not guarantee safety, but ordinary nights were maintained by repeated checking. Stable workers cared for horses used by guards, messengers, officials, and the imperial household. They forked bedding, carried feed, inspected hooves, brushed coats, repaired tack, and managed illness. A court procession displayed polished harness and controlled animals. The stable showed hay, manure, leather oil, and the patient labor behind that display. Water carriers made another essential circuit. Wells and transported water supplied cleaning, cooking, drinking, and firefighting. Hundreds of large vats stood around palace courtyards as immediate reservoirs against flame. Keeping them filled required attention, especially in dry weather. Keeping them usable in winter required heat beneath some vats, so ice did not seal the water away. The Forbidden City's fire protection combined stored water, jetting devices that could spray it, architectural separations, trained teams, guard stations, and regulations. Palace Museum materials described 308 large vats and, by 1729 under the Yongjing Emperor, a network of 1,288 trained firefighters across 37 stations. The exact readiness changed over time, but the scale reflects the danger of fire in a wooden city. Fire teams included eunuchs in earlier arrangements and later 8-banner soldiers and imperial guards in more professional organizations. Equipment waited at stations. Men trained to move quickly, remain calm, and operate pumps or jetting buckets. On most days, they did not fight a fire. They inspected, practiced, and waited. Laundry and clothing maintenance created another hidden system. Robes could contain silk, embroidery, fur, metal buttons, beadwork, and delicate trim. They could not be treated like ordinary cloth. Stains, moisture, insects, folding creases, and seasonal storage all required care. Fur garments emerged for winter and returned to protected chests when spring came. Footwear wore out against palace stone. Soles needed repair. Hats required stands and boxes. Court beads broke and had to be restrung. A loose fastening notice before a ceremony was a small rescue that no official record would celebrate. Theatrical performances employed their own community of singers, musicians, costume keepers, stage workers, writers, and supervisors. Court opera could be intimate or enormous. Scenery needed storage. Costumes required repair. Instruments needed tuning. A performance beginning at dawn on New Year's Day depended on rehearsals held long before the audience arrived. Gardeners tended old trees, potted plants, seasonal displays, rockeries, paths, and courtyard vegetation. They protected roots through beijing winters and managed water through summer heat. An imperial garden was designed to appear naturally harmonious, which meant someone had to remove the evidence of constant care. Religious spaces required lamps, incense, offerings, textiles, cleaning, and specialist attendance. Ceremonial objects were inventoried. Fruit was replaced. Ash was removed. Calendrical dates changed what needed to be prepared. Devotion, like administration, rested upon timely practical work. Waste also left the palace. Ash, spoiled food, broken materials, manure, wastewater, and ordinary refuse had to be sorted, carried, reused where possible, or removed. Grand architecture produces no less dirt than humble architecture. It only hides the route more carefully. The lowest-ranking workers experienced the palace differently from the people they served. They stood in colder rooms, ate simpler food, owned less time, and could be punished by superiors. Some developed valuable skills or useful connections. Some remained trapped by institution and necessity. The beauty of their workplace did not guarantee a beautiful life. Eunuchs in particular could face hardship, strict discipline, uncertain advancement, and dependence on palace service. Historical research into fugitive eunuchs reminds us that some attempted to leave despite regulations, suggesting the pressure behind official order. A calm sleep story should not turn that hardship into spectacle, but it should not erase it either. The palace also offered forms of community. Workers shared meals, taught newcomers, exchanged favors, remembered routes, and found small pauses during long days. A senior artisan showed an apprentice how much pressure a tool required. A guard saved a warmer place for the next shift. A kitchen worker passed an extra bun to a carrier. At dusk, duties changed rather than ended. Day workers prepared to leave through controlled gates. Their waist tags were checked again. Night guards took position. Lamps were lit. Fuel was counted. Urgent workshops might continue under restricted light, though fire safety discouraged unnecessary flame. One clerk closes his register. He blows gently across the last line until the ink loses its shine. The page records nothing dramatic. 3 repaired stools, a quantity of lamp oil, replacement paper for a study, and wages for 2 craftsmen. Yet these modest entries are the palace breathing. A carpenter wraps his tools. A clockmaker covers an unfinished mechanism. A gardener leans a broom against a wall. A eunuch carries the final message of his shift through a narrow gate. A guard listens as the great door closes. The emperor may never know their names. History may preserve only a few. But the Forbidden City did not maintain itself. Its apparent stillness was created each day by people who swept, lifted, copied, cooked, checked, repaired, warmed, guarded, watered, wounded, washed, and waited. We can remain in the service courtyard until the light is almost gone. Work tables fade into shadow. The last metal gear reflects a point of amber from the lamp. A rolled painting rests safely in its box. Charcoal glows behind the grate of a heating stove. Soon, the palace will enter its nightly rhythm. Gates will be secured. Guards will begin their watches. Clocks will sound in private chambers. Fire teams will remain ready beside vats of dark water. The 1,000 hands withdraw one by one, leaving the red walls apparently silent. Their work remains everywhere. In the smooth door, the warm floor, the clear path, the mended robe, the ticking clock, and the lamp that burns without smoke. when the palace went asleep. There is no hurry as the last workers leave the service courtyard. The light has almost vanished, and the Forbidden City is becoming a landscape of dark roofs and amber windows. We have followed its day from the opening gates to the Emperor's desk, through kitchens and private courtyards, into a school before sunrise, and among the workers who repaired the objects and rooms of Imperial life. Now we will stay after the great doors close and listen to the palace settle into night. The gates usually closed near 5 or 6 in the evening, depending on season and regulation. A gate did not simply swing shut. Expected people had to be accounted for. Leaves of the door, thick and reinforced with rows of bosses, turned slowly on their fittings. Bars and locks took their places. Guards began a different kind of watch. Outside the walls, Beijing continued. Vendors packed their goods. Cooking smells drifted into lanes. Courtyard households gathered around evening lamps. Watchmen and patrols moved through the city. The palace stood within that larger life, while carefully separating itself from it. Inside, the broad southern courts emptied first. The Hall of Supreme Harmony rose above marble terraces, its doors closed and its throne unseen. Moonlight flattened the carving of the stone ramps. Bronze vessels held pale edges. With ceremony removed, the largest court became a quiet measure of distance. The northern inner court retained more points of light. The emperor's working rooms, residential palaces, senior households, guard posts, shrines, and service spaces followed their own schedules. One window darkened while another remained bright. The palace did not sleep all at once. In the Hall of Mental Cultivation, the emperor completed the last work of the day. Some rulers continued late with memorials. Others followed different habits. The surviving archive tempts us to imagine endless diligence because papers preserve work more readily than idleness. A responsible picture leaves room for reading, conversation, private entertainment, religious practice, illness, fatigue, and rest. On this evening, a final bundle of documents waits. The emperor reads only what cannot be delayed. The brush marks a response in Vermilion. A clerk or attendant will begin the next stage of the document's journey. The paper is folded, protected, and carried away. The desk is cleared without losing its order. Brushes are washed or laid aside. The inkstone is covered so dust does not settle on its surface. A seal returns to its box. A lamp is moved far enough from hanging fabric. The second principal meal was eaten hours earlier, but a light refreshment may arrive. Warm tea sends steam against the lid of a covered bowl. There might be fruit, a little pastry, milk tea, or a dish suited to the emperor's preference and condition. Palace physicians and attendants paid attention to digestion, sleep, weather, and signs of illness. Evening food could be comfort and calculation together. The emperor did not necessarily sleep in the room that grand architecture seems to nominate. Qing rulers often favored chambers in the Hall of Mental Cultivation rather than the earlier central residence of the Palace of Heavenly Purity. Sleeping places could change for security, convenience, season, ritual, or preference. Several small bed alcoves might exist within a complex. An outsider could not easily know which held the ruler. This uncertainty had a practical value. A palace full of attendants still needed layers of privacy and protection. Curtains and screens divided space. Guards remained beyond doors. Eunuchs waited within calling distance. The ruler was surrounded and concealed at the same time. In winter, warmth traveled beneath the floor. Brick channels carried hot air from an exterior stove through rooms and under a bed platform before releasing smoke safely outside. The system resembled the fire-heated Kong of northern homes, adapted to palace architecture. Surviving outlets can still be seen at several buildings in the Forbidden City. A eunuch tends the fire from outside. He adds carefully prepared charcoal, sometimes described in palace accounts as high-quality fuel selected to burn steadily with less smoke. He checks the draw and closes the stove mouth. The warmth will rise through stone into a chamber he cannot see. Portable braziers, hand stoves, and foot stoves provided additional heat. Many were made from copper, which conducted warmth well, and palace examples could be decorated with openwork, enamel, and handles. A hand stove was small enough to carry a personal pocket of heat in a building whose corridors remained cold. The luxury of warmth followed rank. The emperor, empress dowager, empress, high consorts, and certain important halls received fuel and equipment unavailable to everyone. Guards at outer gates and servants in peripheral rooms experienced winter more directly. The heat beneath an imperial bed was produced by someone kneeling in the cold. Fire was therefore both servant and threat. The Ming and Qing palace relied on flame for cooking, light, incense, warmth, and ritual. Its buildings relied on timber, painted beams, paper windows, silk curtains, lacquer screens, stored books, theatrical costumes, and wooden partitions offered fire an easy path. More than 20 major fires struck the Forbidden City across the Ming and Qing periods, according to palace museum summaries. Some halls burned and were rebuilt more than once. The palace visible today is not a collection of untouched buildings from one year, but a place repeatedly repaired after flame, weather, war, and age. One Qing account tells of a fire during the Jiaqing reign associated with embers left near a Nanmu partition in the Palace of Heavenly Purity. The smoldering fuel reignited, and the fire consumed several important halls. The episode was remembered in later discussions of palace heating and fire rules. We will not follow its flames tonight. Instead, we remain in an ordinary year when prevention succeeds. Large vats stood throughout the courtyards holding water. Palace museum materials count 308 surviving or recorded firefighting vats, made chiefly of copper or iron and large enough to keep an immediate reserve near vulnerable halls. They were called by auspicious names such as peace vats, though their purpose was practical. At the foot of one vat, a small winter fire prevents the water from freezing. A fitted cover reduces ice and debris. A guard or worker checks it. The dark surface reflects a strip of moon. Firefighting devices known as jitong could draw water and project it toward flames, functioning somewhat like hand-operated water pumps. Architectural divisions also help prevent a fire from crossing unchecked from the inner court to the outer court. Walls, open courtyards, and controlled spaces formed passive defenses. Human readiness formed another layer. After serious fires, Qing emperors strengthened palace fire teams. The Yongjing emperor developed a professional organization drawing upon 8 banner soldiers and imperial guards, as well as earlier eunuch teams. Palace museum accounts state that by 1729, 1,288 trained firefighters were distributed among 37 stations. On our quiet night, one such station holds men, tools, and the sleepy expectation that nothing will happen. A guard checks a jetting bucket. Another adjusts his coat. Someone pours hot water into a plain bowl. Preparedness is mostly waiting. Night watch divided time into expected intervals. Traditional Chinese timekeeping used double hours and watch periods, while mechanical clocks increasingly sounded within the Qing palace. The transition was layered rather than immediate. Sundials served daylight. Older clepsydra traditions measured water. Drums, bells, human calls, incense, and clocks all helped organize time in different contexts. By the 18th century, mechanical clocks were abundant at court. The Palace Museum preserves more than 1,500 clocks and watches dating from the 17th century onward. Many entered during Qianlong's reign, reflecting his court's appetite for elaborate mechanisms and the wider exchange connecting Beijing with Guangzhou, European makers, imperial workshops, and tribute networks. Some clocks came from Britain, France, or Switzerland. Chinese workshops in Guangzhou and Suzhou made distinctive pieces. The imperial workshops built and repaired others. The objects could tell time, chime quarters, play music, animate figures, turn flowers, imitate birds, display astronomical information, or simply astonish. In a private room, a gilded clock reaches the hour. A mechanism releases. A tiny figure moves across a stage. Bells play a short melody. The emperor or consort who first received the object may have watched every motion with delight. Tonight, after years of familiarity, an attendant only confirms that it has sounded correctly. The clock needs winding. A key turns against spring tension. Too little force and the mechanism will stop early. Too much and a component may strain. The attendant or specialist wins until experience says enough. Time itself became an item of maintenance. Clockmakers cleaned pivots, repaired teeth, replaced cords or chains, adjusted balances, and adapted imported parts. A magnificent clock that did not run was still decoration, but the court valued motion. Somewhere in a workshop, tomorrow's failed mechanism is already waiting. The musical clock falls silent. Traditional night sounds return. A guard's signal, the movement of a door, wind beneath an eave, the small crack of cooling wood, and perhaps the call of a night bird from Jingshan. The roof ridges hold rows of ceramic figures. In daylight, they seem decorative and precise. At night, they become low silhouettes against the sky. Rainwater channels wait dry along the eaves. The yellow glaze loses its color under the moon. In the 6 eastern and western palaces, evening routines end at different hours. An elderly resident may have retired early. A young attendant remains awake beside a curtain. A woman finishes prayer before a private shrine. A child asks for water. A maid adds a quilt and checks the bed warmer. Lamps are reduced one by one. Oil is valuable. An unnecessary flame is dangerous. Wicks are extinguished with care rather than blown toward hanging fabric. A faint curl of smoke rises inside the lamp cover. The darkness within a palace room is deeper than modern darkness. There is no electric glow beneath a door, no distant traffic light reflected on the ceiling. Moonlight enters through paper windows as a soft gray. The warmest objects are not seen but felt. The floor, the bedding, the hand stove losing heat. The beds themselves differ from the large exposed European beds, often shown in historical films. Chinese sleeping arrangements could use raised platforms, alcoves, curtains, cushions, quilts, and Kong-like heated surfaces. In palace rooms, carved woodwork and embroidered textiles made intimate enclosures within larger chambers. Sleep was not always private. Attendants remained nearby. A call in the night needed an answer. Security, health, status, and custom placed other people within hearing. The emperor's loneliness and lack of solitude could exist at the same time. Dreams left little record. A meal list can tell us what entered the room. An inventory can list the quilt. A medical archive may record a restless night when illness mattered. But an ordinary dream disappears with the person who woke from it. Beyond the residential compounds, guards patrol prescribed routes. They check gates and listen for unusual sounds. A wooden clapper or spoken signal may mark their presence. The patrol's regular return reassures the next post that all is well. The matching tally remains ready for emergency passage. If urgent news comes from outside, one half must be brought and fitted to the half held at the gate. The carved yin and yang portions confirm each other. Only then can the night boundary open. Most nights bring no such message. The gate stays barred. The guard leans briefly into the shelter of the gatehouse, where a brazier gives a modest warmth. His shift will end, another will begin, and the register will record nothing unusual. At the kitchens, fires have been reduced. A worker inspects ash for hidden embers. Food boxes are stacked. Water vessels stand ready. Grain containers are closed against pests. A cat, useful and tolerated near stores, moves through shadow with more freedom than most people in the palace. In the stables, horses shift their weight. Hay rustles. A stable hand checks an animal that seemed tired earlier. He runs a palm down the leg, feels for heat, and settles the bedding. The Imperial household will need the horse tomorrow, but tonight it needs only quiet. The workshops are dark, except perhaps for a guarded lamp where urgent work continues. A clock movement rests beneath cloth. A half-carved piece of jade waits exactly where the artisan left it. Pigment has dried in a covered dish. Tools lie in rows. In the library, books sleep behind closed doors. The belvedere of literary profundity stands under its black, glazed roof, the color associated with water and auspicious defense against fire. Shelves hold texts copied and collected from across centuries. Paper contracts slightly in the cold. A binding gives a minute sound no one hears. The complete library of the four treasuries attempted to gather an enormous field of Chinese writing into classified form. Its creation also involved selection, exclusion, correction, and imperial control. At night, those political decisions become silent volumes in boxes and cabinets. Religious spaces keep other forms of watch. A lamp may continue before an image. Incense has burned down to ash. Offerings wait until morning. The palace's rituals connect ruler, ancestors, deities, dynasty, seasons, and cosmic order. But at this hour the shrine is simply a small pool of light. The last theater costumes hang in storage. Embroidered sleeves that represented gods, generals, scholars, and spirits are empty. Drums rest on their stands. A gong's surface reflects the dim room. Tomorrow or next festival, performers will give them voices again. Snow begins, very lightly. It touches the dark roofs and disappears at first. Then a thin line remains on the colder ridges. In courtyards where the stone retained daytime warmth, flakes melt. On shaded marble, they gather. The Forbidden City in snow has become one of its most admired modern images, but for palace workers, snow meant labor. Before dawn, routes would need clearing. Roof loads and slippery steps required attention. Water vats had to remain usable. Fuel deliveries became more important. For now, the snow muffles sound. The red walls become almost black. White gathers on the yellow tiles until color returns only beneath the eaves. Inside a warm chamber, the emperor sleeps. It is impossible to know the content of this particular night, because our day is a careful composite rather than the reconstruction of one dated diary. The purpose is not to pretend we watched Qianlong breathe. It is to understand the systems surrounding a Qing ruler: documents, service, food, family, learning, craft, heat, security, and time. The palace was a home, but never only a home. It was a workplace, ritual center, archive, school, workshop, fortress, theater, museum-like collection, and seat of government. Daily life moved among all these identities without needing to name them. For the empress, a kitchen worker, a young prince, a guard, a clockmaker, and a palace maid, the same bell could mean different things. One heard a schedule. One heard the end of duty. One heard a call to begin. One heard only that sleep had been interrupted. Rank arranged comfort and danger unevenly. Imperial residents received rich textiles, selected food, guarded rooms, and sophisticated heating. Workers carried weight, endured weather, followed strict discipline, and often remained unnamed. Yet the comfort at the center was never independent of the labor at the edges. If we could lift the roof from the sleeping palace without disturbing it, we would see many small islands of warmth. A bed platform in one residence, a gatehouse brazier, a fire station kettle, a stable lantern, a shrine lamp, a heating stove tended from outside. Between those islands lay courtyards of cold stone. Paths crossed and recrossed them during the day. At night, snow erased the marks. The hours move on. A clock chimes, and then another answers from farther away, slightly out of agreement. Mechanical time has entered the palace, but perfect synchronization has not. One clock runs fast. One is stopped. One plays music so elaborate that it is silenced overnight. A watchman marks his interval. Another turns a page in the guard register. The ink thickens in the cold. He warms the brush between his fingers before writing. Near dawn, the eastern edge of the sky becomes faintly lighter. The snow has stopped. Roofs and terraces hold a thin white covering. Smoke rises from the first rekindled stoves. The palace wakes from the edges inward again. A kitchen fire takes. A broom begins at one corner of a courtyard. The gate guards prepare their registers. A prince is called from sleep. The emperor's writing tools are arranged. The cycle repeats, but repetition does not make every day identical. A festival may fill the halls. A storm may delay movement. News from a province may change the ruler's attention. A sick child may keep a household awake. A broken clock may occupy a workshop. A fallen tile may summon a repair team. Daily life is the meeting of routine and small variation. History often preserves the variation because it creates an event. Sleep, meals, cleaning, study, and quiet work preserve the routine in objects and regulations. To walk through the Forbidden City slowly is to let both kinds of evidence remain. The Great Southern Gate will open. Officials will dismount and continue on foot. Workers will show their wooden waste tags. Food and fuel will cross designated thresholds. Memorials will arrive. Orders will leave. The emperor will read beneath lamplight until daylight makes the lamp unnecessary. The imperial kitchen will send its first covered boxes. Women in the inner court will open shutters. Princes will copy their lessons. Artisans will return to clocks, books, jade, enamel, doors, and roofs. The palace will appear to command all this motion, yet it will also depend upon it. Our night is nearly over. We can walk one final time along the central axis without meeting anyone. Behind us are the imperial garden and the residential palaces. Ahead are the halls of the outer court, their roofs pale beneath the new sky. We cross beneath a gate and enter a broad courtyard. Snow softens the paving stones. The marble terraces are empty. The throne hall waits with its doors closed, not yet transformed by ceremony. In the distance, a broom makes a slow, sweeping sound. It begins, pauses, and begins again. Nothing dramatic is required to end our visit. The Forbidden City has given us a quieter truth. Its famous walls enclosed not an endless pageant, but a great accumulation of ordinary tasks. Brushes touched paper. Water came to a boil. Children recited lines. Clothing was mended. Floors were warmed. Badges were checked. Clocks were wound. Lamps were extinguished. The red walls held ambition, inequality, ritual, and authority, but they also held fatigue. Emperors yawned. Guards longed for the end of a shift. Students watched the light move across a page. Attendants listened to a sleeping room. The palace was extraordinary because so much ordinary life was organized within it. We pass through the Meridian Gate as morning reaches Beijing. The door is open now, and the world outside is returning. A cart moves along a distant street. Smoke rises from neighborhood kitchens. Jingshan behind the palace catches the first light. You do not need to carry the schedules, ranks, gates, or names with you. Let them remain where they belong, arranged quietly behind the vermilion walls. Keep only the gentle sounds, a brush over paper, tea beneath a porcelain lid, snow on glazed tiles, and one clock finishing its song. The courtyards recede. The amber windows become small points and then disappear. Roof after roof settles beneath the pale morning sky. Thank you for spending the night in history with me. I'm the Yawning Historian. Good night.